My name is Dan Hobbins. I'm an associate professor of medieval history here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Graham Loud, who is Professor Emeritus of Medieval History at the University of Leeds, where he taught from 1978 to 2019. His primary area of expertise is Norman Italy, perhaps the most complex environment in all of the Latin West. We always think, and at least I in my teaching talk about Iberia, but here you have a blending of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Greek, and even Norman elements. Perhaps for that reason, it was very understudied until Professor Loud came along. His focus has long been the Latin kingdom of Sicily, so around 1000 to 1200, consisting, for those who don't know, of the island of Sicily with the southern third of the Italian mainland. Rather than list all his publications, I thought I might single one out and describe it to you to give you an idea of the kind of work that he does. A big question answered with impeccable research and clarity about the stakes of the project. We're all, of course, familiar with the Norman conquest of 1066. Well, it turns out that there was another Norman conquest in 1130 when Count Roger II of Sicily created the Latin Kingdom of Sicily. I recall reading in a medieval survey early on in my formation, the Normans get done conquering England, the account went something like this, and after all, they're Vikings, and they have an eternal imperative to rape, pillage, and plunder, so they need something else to conquer. So they get in their longboats and head down to the Mediterranean and conquer southern Italy. Something like that. Well, it's far more surprising, after all, since England was right across the channel from Normandy, but here we have the Normans in the Mediterranean. Or do we? For some medieval historians, it's always seemed rather implausible that men from northern France actually invaded southern Italy in the 11th century. Professor Loud addressed this problem in an article published in Nottingham Medieval Studies back in 1981. How Norman, he asked, was this Norman conquest of southern Italy? And he concluded, after a thorough critique of the evidence, that yes, in fact, it was a Norman conquest. You might have thought I was going somewhere else. It was, in fact, a Norman conquest, carried out mostly, not entirely, but mostly by genuine Normans. Not just Frenchmen, all lumped together under a single term, but in fact, Normans. But crucially, that conquest was an evolutionary process that began a century before the conquest of 1130. Even more crucially, and here we're kind of getting to the punchline, I suppose, owing in large part to the physical geography of the place, mountain chains cutting the landscape into pieces, large forests that were later cut down. The control of the Normans took a long time to fully establish itself. He cites the example of a couple of local counts who put the regnal years, even after the Norman conquest, put the regnal years of Byzantine emperors in their charters. Sort of in defiance of the Norman counts, these Byzantine emperors, men who had no effect at all on their conduct. So a Norman conquest? Norman, mostly, he concluded, but how much was it really a conquest? His other, I'll breeze through his other work. He has the most recent monograph, The Social World of the Abbey of Cava, takes him into the whole social world of southern Italy. The Latin Church in Norman Italy, a master class on showing how notions of papal monarchy, this is 2007, worked their way into this world, the spread of monasteries, the conversion of the island of Sicily, which was still mostly Muslim at the time of the Norman conquest of 1130. And since he's a historian of southern Italy in the 12th century, that means almost by definition, he's also an expert on medieval German history. Specifically, the Staufen period from the early 12th to the first half of the 13th century, including the reigns of Frederick Barbarossa. We just have his biography, his new biography of and Frederick II, who were, of course, quite involved in Italy. So in the course of all this research, naturally, Professor Loud has explored numerous archives, as I think we'll learn today. So his talk, without any further ado, the Sicilian Chancery from the Normans to Frederick II. Please welcome Professor Loud.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I used to tell my students there are two Norman conquests, the conquest of England and the interesting one. Around the year 1196, a South Italian cleric called Peter of Eboli wrote a long narrative poem celebrating the conquest of the Kingdom of Sicily by the German Emperor Henry VI, whose wife Constance claimed to be the legitimate heiress of the kingdom. The poem survives in a unique deluxe illustrated manuscript. Yep. Quite possibly intended for the emperor himself. It began with an account of the death of King William II of Sicily in 1189 and described how the people of Palermo, learned in 3 languages, mourned him. The accompanying picture of the king's deathbed showed him attended by, among others, a certain Achim the physician. Oh, no. Top left, anyway. Achim the physician was clearly an Arab. 4 pages later, the multilingual nature of the kingdom was once again emphasized by another illustration, top right, showing 3 pairs of notaries writing in Greek, Arabic, and Latin, respectively. The theme of my lecture today, and indeed the theme of this series of lectures, could hardly be better illustrated. The Kingdom of Sicily, created in 1130 and including not just the island of Sicily, but also the southern third of the Italian peninsula, was a multilingual and multicultural entity. While most of the mainland population comprised Romance-speaking Latin Christians, the southern part of Apulia, the Salento Peninsula or Terra d'Otranto, and most of Calabria was Greek-speaking, the southern half of Calabria overwhelmingly Grecophone. And these areas followed the religious rites of the Orthodox Church of Constantinople. About a third of the population of Sicily were also Greek, concentrated primarily in the northeast of the island. The other 2/3 of the population was still, in 1130, Arabic speakers, mainly Muslim, but with a far from negligible minority of Arabic-speaking Christians. Overlaying this population was a very small governing class of Normans, not all necessarily from the Duchy of Normandy, even if many of them were, but all Francophone and Latin Christians. By 1130, however, any sense of Norman identity was already diminishing among this group, most of whom were by then 2nd or 3rd generation immigrants. The other factor beginning to influence the demographic and cultural balance of the new kingdom was the immigration of Latin Christians to the island of Sicily, but this was as yet relatively small scale and largely confined to the southeast of the island. Given the population structure of southern Italy, it was natural that each of the linguistic groups generated their own documentation, and furthermore, this was reflected in the workings of government. The royal administration after 1130 issued documents in Greek, Arabic, and Latin. But this was historically a relatively brief phase. Ironically, by the time Peter of Eboli wrote, some 65 years after the unification of the kingdom, the trilingual and tricultural identity of the island of Sicily was already in decline. By the end of the century, the royal chancery and other parts of the administration had become almost exclusively Latin institutions. How and why that change came about, and what this development has to tell us about the wider history of the Kingdom of Sicily, is the theme of my lecture. We should, however, begin by defining our terms. The subject of our lecture series is, roughly speaking, multicultural chanceries. Yet in the 12th century Kingdom of Sicily, this phrase should be interpreted as including not just one, but two sections of government. On the one hand, there was the royal chancery proper, that is, the writing office that produced documents in the ruler's name, most of which were granting or confirming property or privileges, or as time went on, executive mandates, in which the king instructed somebody, usually a royal official, to do something. Investigate a complaint, convene a court, put someone in possession of a disputed property, supervise the election to a bishopric or abbacy, and so on. But there was also another office, the Diwan al-Taqiq al-Maymur, or Office of Land Registration, the competence of which was limited to Sicily and Calabria, which this office kept records for state boundaries and services owed, Arabic dafatir, and lists of serfs on particular estates, jarida, and also issued documents concerned with inquiries into disputed property, or sometimes confirming a landholder in possession of a certain property. It would seem for the most part that the personnel of these two offices, the Chancery and the Diwan, were not interchangeable. And given that most of the documents issued by the Office of Land Registration were either bilingual Greek and Arabic, or sometimes only in Arabic, it is hardly surprising that most of the officials who can be identified were Arabs. One should note, however, the royal officials had to be, at least nominally, Christian, although the religious loyalties of such officials was complex. Some contemporaries, both Christian and Muslim, suggested that any conversion to Christianity was feigned, and the survival of several signature mottos, alama, of these officials, which have clear Quranic references, would argue that this view was correct. Yet in 1186, the Bishop of Patti in northeast Sicily could say of one senior Arab official who used such an alama that not only was he a brother of our church, but that we especially follow his guidance in the affairs of our church. So yes, the religious identity was complex. Since Sicily had been under Islamic rule for almost 2 centuries before the Norman conquest of 1061 to 91, one might at least at first sight suppose there was a strong element of continuity in the administration of the island before and after the Norman conquest and into the mid-12th century. Yet, in fact, this was not the case. The administration of Count Roger I of Sicily, who died in 1101, and that of his 2 sons who succeeded him in turn, was predominantly Greek. Those of their officials who could be identified were Greek, and the documents issued in the Count's name were, for the most part, written in Greek, even sometimes documents that favoured Latin Rite churches. The predominance of the Greek element is in fact hardly surprising. Roger I's main residence was at Mileto in Calabria, in an overwhelmingly Grecophone area. While his widow Adelaide, acting as regent for her young sons, moved the principal comital residence to the island, this was for some years at Messina, at the heart of the Greek-speaking northeast. It was only after 1112 that Roger II transferred his main base to Palermo. And even then, insofar as we can trace his itinerary over the next 15 years or so, he spent more time in eastern Sicily and Calabria than he did in western Sicily, with its predominantly Arabic population. Indeed, the only evidence for some administrative continuity in Sicily that we have comes circa 1093-1095, when it seems that various jarida were compiled listing peasants and services they owed on the lands of major landowners. And no doubt this was a consequence of the substantial redistribution of lands on the island that Count Roger made to his followers in the early 1090s, after the conquest was concluded, to which the contemporary chronicler Geoffrey Malaterra refers. And it seems probable that existing administrative records, which would have been largely in Arabic, were consulted in drawing up these documents. Yet all that survives from this process is a grand total of 2 documents. One for the Archbishopric of Palermo and the other for the Bishopric of Catania. Both documents are primarily in Greek, though incorporating lists of serfs in Arabic within them. We have later references to several other similar documents from the same period, but quite what they comprised is hard to know. The documents don't exist, and it may be significant that some of these later references refer to them by the Greek term platei rather than the Arabic jarida. So were they in fact in Greek? After 1101, the evidence for the use of Arabic as an administrative language is even thinner. There is one bilingual jarida dating from 1111. This refers to only 8 villeins granted by the Count to one of his knights, so hardly a very significant document. And we have a couple of bilingual charters, one of which survives only in a late and possibly dubious copy. It would seem, therefore, that while some use may have been made of Arabic documents and scribes in the immediate wake of the conquest of the island, this soon fell into abeyance. Sicily, and those parts of Calabria belonging to the Counts of Sicily, were run by Greek officials. Thus, far from being a development from existing administrative practice, the emergence of the Diwan al-Taqiq al-Maimur during the 1130s was an innovation. The architect of this was George of Antioch, a Greek who became the king's principal minister, his emir of emirs, or in Latin, admiratus admiratorum, round about 1126. Arabic sources refer to him as the king's vizier. Oh, sorry. That is a typical example of a Greek-Arabic jarida, but that is considerably later, from 1178. Here we have George of Antioch. He's the person who looks a bit like a turtle in the bottom right. This, I think, is the result of some rather handed 19th century restoration. But this is from the Church of the Martirana in Palermo, which George himself founded. George remained as the king's chief minister until his death in 1151. As his name implies, he was not a native Sicilian. He may have begun his career by working as a Byzantine official, but he then found employment with the Zirid rulers of Ifriqiya, roughly speaking modern Tunisia, apparently as a financial expert, before falling out of favour and fleeing to Sicily circa 1109. He was therefore fluent in Arabic as well as Greek. And the major influence on the development of the new office came from Fatimid Egypt, with which King Roger and his minister were in close diplomatic contact during the 1120s and 30s. George himself led one embassy to Cairo during the early 1120s before he became the king's chief minister. Only a single letter survives from this diplomacy, from the Caliph al-Hafiz to King Roger round about 1138, but this very amicable missive refers to several previous communications. It's clearly part of a series, and to an exchange of gifts between one ruler and another. The Office of Land Registration established in Sicily essentially mirrored Fatimid practice. And many of the Arabic formulae and royal titles employed by the scribes copied Fatimid protocol. Where it differed from Egypt was in the use of bilingual Greek and Arabic documents. The Greek usually for the introduction of dispositive clauses, while the detailed descriptions of boundaries and in the case of Jarida, the lists of serfs were in Arabic, although these serf lists sometimes had interlinear Greek transcriptions. Now, this was the case even for documents intended for Latin recipients. Occasionally, other documents, both records of royal donations and records of boundaries, might be exclusively in Arabic. The recipients here were usually Greek, which would tend to support the view advanced by modern historians that there was a high level of bilingualism in 12th century Sicily. But the use of Arabic also reflects that after 2 centuries of Islamic rule, most of the place names in use on the island, and thus employed in the boundary clauses, were Arabic. That the Muslim population was still in the majority over the island as a whole, and that Muslims as well as Christians gave evidence to the inquiries that produced these documents. Now, the reign of Roger II as Count and then King also saw the development of the royal chancery proper. Under his father, or indeed during the regency of Countess Adelaide, there seems not to have been a chancery in the sense of an organised writing office with clearly defined personnel and practices. Nor is it easy to say who actually wrote these documents. The relatively few Latin documents would seem to have been written by comital chaplains, as one might expect. But the Greek charters don't name notaries, and nearly all of these have anyway been transmitted only in later Latin translations. 78 known documents of Roger I, which actually have texts, survive. Of these, only 6 survive in the original, 3 Latin, 1 Greek, and 2 Jarida. So neither paleography nor phraseology and diplomatic are of assistance here. We can't obviously assume that a later Latin translation preserves the exact phraseology of the Greek document. We can't rule out that at least some of these early comital charters may have been written by the recipients, and certainly there appears as yet to have been little standardization of form. Under Roger II, however, and especially after he became king in 1130, a real chancery did develop with specialised personnel and clear diplomatic models. This, to begin with, however, the principal language for written administration remained Greek. This predominance is reflected in the admittedly relatively meagre surviving documentation. Only some 200 chancery documents survive from the 48 and a half years that Roger ruled as Count and then King, September 1105 till February 1154. Of these, 86 were issued in Latin and 114 in Greek or Greek and Arabic, though again many of the Greek documents only survive in later Latin translations. The ratio between the two is in fact even more marked, since almost 40% of the Latin documents are, in their present form, forgeries, albeit a few of these may be improved versions of genuine originals. How many forgeries there may be among the Greek documents is hard to determine, both because of the problems of transmission already mentioned, and even more so since the long-promised edition of the Greek charters of King Roger has never appeared. I suspect the number of forgeries among the Greek documents, however, is relatively slight. Now, the coronation of Roger as king was one obvious reason for the development of a formally organised chancery, even though its origins may date back a little before 1130. But monarchical rulers were expected to issue formal documents of considerable complexity, and royal documents needed to be clearly identifiable. This was part of the image of rulers just as much as ceremonial dress or court protocol. For King Roger, ruling a new kingdom of which the circumstances of its creation were controversial and facing significant challenges both internal and external, it was important for his royal status to be proclaimed by all possible means. And it can't be stressed too much that King Roger was a newcomer to the top table of European royalty, and he was regarded as such. The late Timothy Reuter, in one of his more fanciful footnotes, suggested that most contemporaries in Western medieval Europe regarded King Roger a bit as we would look at Saddam Hussein today. That dates him a bit. So, King Roger needed to appear like a proper king. But the other stimulus to the development of the Chancery was the extension of Roger's authority to the mainland in the years 1127 to 30. The takeover of the Duchy of Apulia in 1127-8 and the submission of the Principality of Capua in 1129 brought under his rule regions whose culture was overwhelmingly Latinate. Documents addressed to recipients in these areas needed to be written in Latin, whereas previously almost all documents issued in the Count's name were written in Greek, and only 7 genuine Latin charters of Roger II survive from before 1127. Yet the change within the writing office was still evolutionary. This is an example of an early Latin charter of King Roger to a bishopric in Apulia in 1134. You can see, it's, even from this rather poor photograph, that it is quite an impressive document. Primary language of the Royal Chancery into the 1130s, even, for example, for Latin recipients on the island of Sicily. And though more Latin charters were written after 1130, there seems only to have been one Latin notary writing documents at any one time during the 1130s. And from 1132 to 6, we know that his name was Guido. During the 1140s, however, the volume of chancery activity in Latin increased, and there appears to have been at least 3 such notaries operating in concert. The other notable aspect of the Latin documents after 1130 was that their format became more standardised. The formulae still took some years to evolve. The royal title was, for example, only fixed after the imposition of direct rule on the Principality of Capua in 1135. But from 1140 onwards, by which time King Roger had consolidated his rule over the mainland and also extended this into the Abruzzi in central Italy, the format of Latin royal diplomata was clearly established and followed a standard pattern. And the royal diplomata looked like this. They began with the Invocatio, in the name of God eternal and of our Saviour Jesus Christ. They followed with the Salutatio, the address to the recipient, King Roger to his faithful subject, so on. The Arenga, a formal introduction, usually explaining the particular duties of kingship to which this document pertained, written in the rhyming prose of the Latin cursus. The Dispositio, the main text explaining what the document's about. Of course, when you're reading these documents, that's the bit you zero in on. The sanctio, the penalty clause, the corroboratio at the end, where the notary was named, and then finally a dating clause, which named the official who supervised the drawing up of the document, either the Chancellor or, in his absence, a deputy or other royal minister. Diplomata were often authenticated with the rota, a circular sign manual placed between the corroboratio and the dating clause, although not all King Roger's diplomata have the rota, became more standard later on. The rota was, which of course is called a wheel, literally, it's circular, was only used in Latin Chancery documents, not Greek ones. Now, several features are notable here. Almost all the surviving Latin documents of the first two kings, Roger and his son William I, who was king 1154 to 66, are formal diplomata, either embodying a privilege or sometimes resolving a legal dispute. Some of the diplomatic formulae were taken from external sources. The dating clause, for example, seems to have been derived from German imperial practice. The use of the rota came from the papal chancery, and we find some South Italian archbishops also using it. We should note, however, that the earlier Lombard princes of Capua had employed a monogram incorporating their name to authenticate their privileges, and this practice was continued by their Norman successors after 1158. The principle was, of course, the same as the rota, as a badge of authenticity. Seals, bullae, were of metal, usually lead, which again seems to have copied papal practice, although the Byzantines also employed these. A few particularly prestigious and significant privileges had gold seals appended, something copied from the German emperors. Examples of these included King Roger's privilege to the Pierleoni family, the family of Pope Anacletus II in 1134, William I's privilege for the city of Genoa in 1156, that of his son for the same city in 1174, and William II's foundation charter for the Abbey of Monreale outside Palermo in 1178. Two very important privileges of King Roger, one that for the Pierleoni family and the foundation charter for his palace chapel in 1140, were written in gold-coloured ink on purple vellum, in imitation of Western imperial practice. Though I should stress the Western emperors only used this very occasionally for particularly prestigious recipients. This extravagant practice was not subsequently continued by the Royal Chancery. Alongside these formal diplomata, the Latin section of the Chancery also employed another standardised document, the mandate, and the text of the mandate looked like this. You'll forgive me, given the constraints of time, if I don't give you a line-for-line translation. But the point to note, it is a relatively simple document. It's not very long, and though it has a dating clause, it doesn't say who dated it, neither does it say who wrote it. The use of mandates began in the 1140s, but to begin with only fairly sparingly. Later, during the reign of William II, mandates become much more common and were clearly an important tool for the effective working of royal government. This particular mandate from 1168 is notifying that a nunnery in Naples is actually exempt from all dues owed on a particular bit of property. Now, One should stress that the formulae utilised in the Latin charters are not simply translations of those employed in the Greek documents, or vice versa. The Greek documents from the Royal Chancery clearly imitated Byzantine models, as one might expect, whereas the Latin documents followed Western ones. An obvious point of comparison is the royal title. In the Latin charters after 1135, this was, for example, Rogerius de Gratias Siciliae et Italiae Rex. After 1135, this was Rogerius Divina Faventi Clementia Rex Siciliae Ducatus Apuliae et Principatus Capui, thus referring to the three main constituent units of the kingdom. In the Greek charters, this was very different. Rogerius in Christu tu Theo Eusebes, Kratios Rex, Kai ton Christianon Boethos, Roger the pious and powerful king in Christ the God and helper of the Christians. Unlike in the Latin documents, the notary's name was never mentioned in the Greek charters. The main feature that they had in common was the seals, including the occasional use of gold seals for documents of particular importance. There are 5 instances known from the reign of King Roger after 1130, all for important Greek monasteries. Which language was used for any particular document was obviously tied to the destinatee, but also to the prevailing language in the region in which that destinatee or its property was located. An illustration of this comes with 2 confirmations of peasants subject to the Archbishop of Palermo, issued in 1143-5. One, the one on the left, referring to men at Nicotera and Calabria, is entirely in Greek. This was, of course, a Graecophone area. The other, concerning Sicily, of which only a fragment now survives, is partly in Greek, but the names of the villeins are in Arabic, clearly the ones they actually used. Now, we can see from these examples that under King Roger, royal documents written in Greek were still issued for Latin churches in Sicily, and also sometimes in Calabria. Indeed, there now survive, from his entire reign, only 9 documents written in Latin for Sicilian recipients, as opposed to 46 written in Greek or as Greek-Arabic bilingual documents. But that picture was soon to change. The last great flourish of the Greek Chancery came with a wide-ranging inquiry into privileges carried out in 1144-5. All the evidence that we have relating to this comes from Calabria and Sicily, although the phraseology of the relevant documents does not expressly state that the inquiry was only conducted in these Graecophone regions. Some 33 documents linked with this inquiry survive, 2/3 of which are in Greek, and 6 more are bilingual Greek and Arabic. Only 5 of the relevant documents are in Latin. This is one of them for the Calabrian priory of the monastery of Santa Maria in Josaphat, outside Jerusalem. Now, my colleague Jeremy Johns has described this as far and away the busiest period in the history of Roger's Chancery, if not of the entire Norman kingdom. That may be so, given that, even if confined to those regions which had been under comital rule before 1127, much of the parchment generated by this inquiry has undoubtedly been lost. But after 1145, the production of Greek charters by the Royal Chancery declined exponentially. Only 4 Greek documents issued by the Chancery survive from the last 8 years of King Roger's reign, all of them for destinaties in Sicily. And the picture is even more marked after 1154. Of the 35 surviving charters of William I, 29 are in Latin, 4 in Greek, 2 Greek and Arabic, and 1 in Arabic. Of round about 150 charters surviving for William II, something like 143 are in Latin, 6 in Greek, 1 is bilingual. There's only 1 Greek charter from the fairly short reign of King Tancred and 1 from Constance's reign. While there was still some limited need to write documents in Greek, such activity, therefore, was clearly at a very low level, and the Chancery's production of Latin documents was at a much higher volume than before. 7 different Latin notaries were active during the early years of Tancred's reign, while during the brief rule of Empress Constance in Sicily, 1195-8, 6 notaries were working in consort. How do we explain this change? One might suggest 3 interrelated reasons. The first was the appointment to the Chancery of a man called Mayo of Bari, who from 1144 onwards can be found in royal documents as the Scrinarius, literally translated archivist. Mayo went on to become the all-powerful chief minister of William I before he was assassinated in November 1160. We mainly know of him today through the contemporary Sicilian chronicler, known, almost certainly wrongly, as Hugo Falcandus, who devoted the early part of his work and his considerable powers of invective to a bitterly hostile portrayal of the royal minister. This man was a beast than whom no more repellent pest could be found. He's drawing here on Cicero's portrait of Catiline, I may say. According to Falcandus, Mayo was a duplicitous and ambitious low-born schemer who took advantage of the credulous king and even sought to displace him. Now, needless to say, Falcandus was hardly an impartial witness, and most of this criticism seems to be grossly unfair, and quite a lot of it blatantly untrue. But for our inquiry today, what is significant is Mayo's role at the Chancery. The nominal head of this office during the 1140s was the Royal Chancellor Robert of Selby, who was actually an Englishman. But in practice, Robert seems to have spent most of his time as the Royal Viceroy in mainland southern Italy, which King Roger rarely visited after 1140. Most royal diplomata after 1144 were dated by Mayo in Robert's absence. So Mayo was the effective head of the royal writing office, even though he only formally became Chancellor after Robert's death in 1151. Given that the leading figure in the Chancery, and after 1154 the king's chief minister, was a man of Latinate culture who may not even have understood Greek, the relative diminution of the Greek section of the Chancery should hardly surprise us. We do admittedly have one Diwani document, written in Arabic from 1152, in which Mayo ordered an inquiry to settle a boundary dispute, and the record of which he signed. But his signature was in Latin, and we cannot therefore assume that he would have understood a document written in Arabic, although no doubt the content was explained to him. Given that he grew up in Bari, which by the 12th century was an overwhelmingly Latin environment, one might suspect that a similar procedure would have held true for Greek documents issued by the Chancery. The Diwan al-Taqiq al-Maymur continued to function both during Mayo's period of preeminence and under his successors after 1160, and his Arabic administrators continued to play quite a prominent role at court, something much criticised by Falkandus, who disliked them. But then Falkandus disliked nearly everybody. While some Greeks continued to play subordinate roles in the royal administration, their relative importance was much diminished, whereas the significance of Latin Christians grew. King Roger's two chief ministers, successively Christodoulos and George of Antioch, had both been Greeks. Maio was a Latin. He was eventually replaced, around about 1162, by a triumvirate of royal familiares. And in a Sicilian context, the word familiaris means principal minister, not just servant. The triumvirate comprised one Christian Arab Diwani official, a Latin bishop, Richard of Syracuse, and Maio's protege and successor as head of the Chancery, Matthew of Salerno. Like Maio, a Latin Christian from the mainland, from the urban patriciate of one of the more important cities. During the minority of William II, there was a brief attempt to go back to having one chief minister, a Norman relative of the Queen Mother, Margaret. But this proved unpopular, and he was soon overthrown. In the summer of 1168, an enlarged governing council was set up, the composition of which was clearly intended to include all the principal interest groups at court. And this comprised 4 Latin bishops, another Latin churchman who was soon to become Archbishop of Palermo, 3 noblemen, all Latins, one of whom was the Queen's brother, Matthew of Salerno, the technocrat, and an Arab Diwani official. The Greeks were conspicuous by their absence. Not perhaps surprisingly, this enlarged governing body proved unwieldy, and fairly soon a smaller group emerged, comprising 3 or later 4 familiares. Matthew, as Vice-Chancellor, remained one of them, right down to his death in 1193. The other 2 or later 3 ministers were all Latin bishops. These ministers took day-to-day charge of the government and could, for example, issue mandates in their own right. Now, the third factor underlying the growing predominance of Romance-speaking Latin Christians at court was a slow but inexorable change in the kingdom's demography, and particularly that of the island of Sicily. The southern half of Calabria and the northeast of Sicily admittedly remained almost exclusively Greek. Messina was still very much a Greek city at the time of the Third Crusade in 1190. But southeastern Sicily was the focus of increasing administration, both from the South Italian mainland and even more so from northern Italy. And this was in part because the leading landowner in the region in the first half of the century was Count Henry of Butera, King Roger's maternal uncle, was from Savona in Liguria in northwest Italy. Falkandus alleged that by 1168 the North Italians on the island were so numerous that they could provide 20,000 fighting men from their settlements in the Val di Noto. And while this figure is, I'm sure, a considerable exaggeration, he simply means a lot. It's clear that by this time the North Italians had a substantial presence on the island. The effect of this immigration was to push the Muslims out of eastern Sicily and into the western half of the island. Now, this was a slow process, and the Arab Muslim population remained substantial into the early 13th century. But with a strong and growing Latin presence on the island, the corollary to this was a Latinization of government, even if to begin with this was at the expense rather of the Greek element of the administration than the Arabic. And one indication of this Latinization comes with the last surviving Jarida issued by the Diwan. This was issued for the monastery of Monreale in 1182 and details the boundaries of the lands given to the new archbishopric. But notice, while much of the content of the document was in Arabic, following normal Diwani practice, the explanatory parts of the document at the top were in Latin, not as hitherto in Greek. Now, whether this was symptomatic of a more general trend in the Office of the Land Registration, we don't know, because this document is a one-off survival. But then we don't know how many documents have been lost. Now, the situation was also to change dramatically during the 1190s. The uncertainty in disputed succession, which followed the death of William II in 1189, led to a rise in intercommunity violence and to attacks upon the Muslim population. Now, these were not unprecedented, and temporary breakdowns of government in 1160 to 61 and 1168 had both seen violence by Christians towards Muslims. But the king in 1161 and the minority government in 1168 had moved swiftly to suppress such outbreaks and to protect the Arabic population. In the early 1190s, however, the attacks were so serious that the Muslims of Western Sicily rose in revolt, and the resulting intifada lasted, with some intervals of truce, for more than 30 years. For much of that period, Western Sicily was ungovernable. How quickly this may have affected the operations of the Diwan and the Arabic officials who ran it, we can't be sure. But it must surely have rendered its operations unfeasible over at least a third of the island. After 1189, we have a single bilingual Arabic-Latin document issued in the name of the Empress Constance for the inhabitants of Malta and Gozo in 1198. It praises them for their loyalty to the crown, takes the island back into the direct possession of the ruler, and gives them a remission of taxation. But whether this can be taken as evidence that the Empress and her advisors wish to continue or perhaps to reinstate the multilingual Diwan, as Najid Jamil and Jeremy Johns have recently argued, seems to me rather doubtful. It's building an awful lot on one document. It does, however, show that a trained Arabic scribe who was familiar with established Diwani protocols and procedures was still available. Another document from the same year, however, shows two senior officials, both of whom were Latins, conducting an inquest at Termini Imerese on the north coast of Sicily, in the traditional manner with a jury of both Christians and Muslims. But the document that resulted from this inquiry was redacted in Latin, with no Arabic elements apart from a single signature. So by then was the Arabic Diwan already morphing into the Latin Duana de Secretis. The Office of Land Registration continued into the 13th century, but its language was no longer Arabic. There is one single anomalous case which might suggest that there was still some use of Arabic. And this comes in an inquest of 1242. Why a bilingual document in Latin and Arabic should have been drawn up 40 years or more after the last such document issued by the Diwan is mysterious. But it certainly, as again Jamil and Johns has shown, cannot be taken as evidence of a continuing tradition. Here, the Latin is clearly the main text, the Arabic a very rough and ready translation, and a long way from the elegant phraseology of earlier Diwan texts. It's written by, apparently, a pretty unskilled scribe. Nor was it issued in the name of the ruler, Frederick II, himself, but in the name of the master of the Duana de Secretis, Hubertus Phalamonica, who was admittedly descended from an Arabic Christian family, but his mother was probably Genoese. If this was an experiment, it was one which was not continued. It's a one-off case. Now, by contrast to the factors I've mentioned, the German conquest by Henry VI in 1194 had much less impact on Sicilian documentary practice than either the Muslim revolt or the already growing predominance of Latin as an administrative language. Henry was largely an absentee ruler. German immigrants played little or no part in the workings of the government at Palermo. With that government conducted in Henry's absence by his wife, Empress Constance, daughter of King Roger, and in her own view, the legitimate heir to the kingdom, there were strong elements of continuity, and it was certainly apparent in the royal chancery. The format of documents remained largely unchanged. There were a higher proportion of mandates, but this tendency was already apparent under William II, and there weren't seemingly significant changes in personnel. 3 of the 6 regular chancery notaries under Constance had worked under King Tancred, and 2 others under William II. But by now, the Chancery was an overwhelmingly Latinate institution. The only exception is a single bilingual Latin-Greek privilege for the Greek monastery of Carboni in the Basilicata, issued in October 1195. The days of purely Greek privileges were over. And other privileges of Constance for Greek churches, even for the monastery of Holy Saviour in Messina, the mother house for all the Basilian monasteries in Sicily, and by far the most wealthiest and most important Greek monastery in the kingdom, were all issued in Latin. In a general sense, perhaps Peter of Ebeli's picture of the notaries from 3 different linguistic groups wasn't entirely inaccurate, in that both Greek and Arab charters were still being written at Palermo during the 1190s, though the Arabic charters cease after 1200, and Greek charters remain the majority of the documents drawn up in Messina until well into the 13th century, and in the hinterland of northeastern Sicily, even into the 14th. But by the 1190s, the royal chancery and royal government generally had already abandoned its multilingual heritage. Now, I'm conscious time is getting on, I will skip over the last bit. But during the early 13th century, and especially after the return of Frederick II to the Regno in 1220, there can be no doubt that the workload of the Chancery greatly increased. Already in the 17 years of rule by Constance and then by the minority government of Frederick II up to 1212, the number of documents, we have 234 documents from this period, which is about 13 surviving documents a year. Relatively small number compared with some other European monarchies, notably the German Empire in the 12th century, but representing an appreciable increase in the time of William II, when we have an average of 7 documents a year. From the last 30 years of Frederick II's rule, from 1220 to 1250, about 580 texts survive as independent charters that were issued by the Chancery to recipients in the Kingdom of Sicily. That's an average of just over 19 a year. There's still not that many, but the steady upward trend continued. The practice also began of keeping registers of outgoing letters and mandates. Unfortunately, the text of only one such register now survives, and that is the text, because the manuscript itself was destroyed in 1943. The content covers the 6 months from October 1239 to the end of March 1240, with some rather more sporadic material included from April and early May 1240. The contents, however, are revealing. More than 1,000 outgoing mandates are listed up till late March. That is an average of between 6 and 7 a day, as composed to 7 a year under William II. Work continued even on Sundays and in the Holy Week before Easter. 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, were devoted to the hearing and answering of petitions under the supervision of the Emperor's two chief bureaucrats, Piero della Vigna and Taddeo of Susa. So the scale and complexity of the Chancery's operations greatly increased during the 13th century. But this was entirely in Latin. By contrast, the number of surviving documents from the 12th century kingdom is relatively few. All we know about the Diwan al-Taqiq al-Mamur comes from about 40 documents. But though it's clear that the surviving documentation is a small fragment of what once existed. There are 42 surviving documents from the reigns of Tancred and his son William III. The modern-day editors suggest that the true figure of documents produced by the Royal Chancellery's period would be about 700. And if anything, that seems to me a bit of an underestimate, based as it is on a calculation of 3 notaries active at any one time, each writing no more than about 5 charters a month. I suspect it's a good bit more. Now, very briefly, why has so little documentation survived? We can point to various general factors which affected all documents. The wholesale loss of archives. We've no archives from lay families at all. Depredations of war. The Turks destroyed the city of Otranto and the cathedral archive in 1480. The Wehrmacht destroyed the entire contents of the Naples State Archive in 1943. A number of bishoprics on the mainland were abandoned due to population change in the late Middle Ages. The archives of these bishoprics have completely disappeared. Earthquake damage has been particularly destructive in Calabria. Very little documentation really survives from Calabria, and we can point to specific instances. Roger I's capital at Mileto was more or less obliterated by an earthquake in 1783. We have virtually no documents surviving from there. And although some Greek monasteries continued to exist for a very long time, the Holy Saviour Messina was only dissolved in 1538. Many Greek monasteries were abandoned as the supply of recruits diminished, and again, their archives were often lost unless they were taken over by a Latin monastery, which also took over the archive. By the late 13th century, it was clear that in any dealings with the royal administration, either central or local, these dealings had to be in Latin. So a large number of previous Greek documents had to be translated. The Greek originals were then lost or disposed of. And such issues are even more striking with regard to the Arabic documentation, both private charters and the documents issued by the Diwan. Some of the latter had already been lost or perhaps deliberately destroyed when the royal palace was looted in the attempted coup of 1161 following the murder of Mayo. And the period from the 1220s to the 1240s saw the obliteration of the Islamic community on the island of Sicily. Now, the details of this remain fairly obscure. Some of the Muslims of Sicily were transported to a new settlement at Lucera in northern Apulia, where a colony was created to provide troops for Frederick II's campaigns on the mainland. Some Muslims doubtless emigrated to Muslim North Africa. Others converted to Christianity and did their best to blend in with the local population. And of course, there was already a minority of Arabic Christians. That there was a high level of bilingualism in the 12th century and as Alex Metcalf has suggested, probably a hybrid lingua franca that enabled Arabic speakers to converse with their Greek and Latin Christian neighbours, can only have helped this process. But the blending in clearly meant privileging the local Sicilian Romance dialect and the decline of Arabic language skills. And this seems to have occurred very quickly. When in 1239 Frederick II wanted one of his servants in Sicily to learn Arabic, perhaps to read documents which were available in the royal archives, this man had to be sent to Lucera to learn Arabic. He couldn't do it on the island. Later on, when there was a need to read Arabic documents in Sicily in the later 13th century, the only people who knew how to do this were the surviving Jewish population of the island. So it's not perhaps surprising that existing Arabic documentation was either disposed of or simply left to moulder. And so, of course, we may conclude with something of a paradox. It's a truism among medieval historians that the Kingdom of Sicily in the 12th century was probably the most advanced and bureaucratic monarchical administration in Western Europe. What survives in that administration, however, is a tiny fragment of what once existed. And it's from these really very slight remains that we have to reconstruct the workings of a highly sophisticated, multilingual government and its eventual evolution into a still advanced, but by the 13th century, entirely monoglot administration. Thank you.